on. Can you hear me? You can, great. Good evening, and thank you very much to the committee of Lytham St Anne's Classical Association for their warm welcome, and for you for coming here on this evening. So, my name's Ben Kane, and in no particular order, I'm an Irishman, an ex-veterinary surgeon, and an author of military historical fiction set in ancient Rome. It's an extremely odd mix, but we don't really have time to go into it. But, oh, no, that's not the right one to press, sorry. So there is the proof on the left that I actually did once practice as a veterinary surgeon, 16 years at the coalface, but now I get to give talks like this and to write exciting novels set 2,000 years ago. It's infinitely more fun than being a vet, and I get to buy things like this and call them business expenses. So the trilogy of books that I'm in the process of finishing concern the events of AD 9 through to AD 16 in northern Germany and the border with, well, what would be part of Holland today. Two of the books have been released already. Eagles at War concerns the ambush itself in AD 9, Hunting the Eagles, the events of AD 14 and 15, and Eagles in the Storm, which is, you can only see the cover of because it hasn't been published yet, but I have actually finished it. That concerns the events of AD 16. These were the years in which Rome wreaked its revenge for what had been done to it. So the Clades Variana in Latin, or the Varian disaster, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, it's also called, it took place in September of AD 9. As we've just heard, 3 Roman legions were wiped out, their iconic standards were taken, and their commanders killed. This was 10% of the standing Roman army wiped out in one go. So a very major defeat, and because it took place during peacetime, it wasn't in a war, it was unexpected. That's why it sent such enormous shockwaves through the empire. Now, you'll read in some textbooks, especially older ones, that this was the sole reason for Rome stopping its expansion over the Rhine. It's not true. It's like Brexit. It's much more complicated than a yes-no vote. It's like everything in life. The notion that this stopped Rome expanding into Germany is a tabloid headline that needs a 4-page article after it. So just don't worry if you can't read all the words on the map. What you need to see there is this is northern Germany and Holland, and you can see Britain there. The pointer should work. This is the River Rhine, and those are the Roman forts that were on it, and that is the River Elbe there. So those are the sort of the things I want you to see. What I thought until probably about 7 years ago, was that Rome stopped at the Rhine. That's what most people think. Well, in AD 9, that was actually far from the truth, because the Romans had been campaigning deep into Germany for more than 20 years at that time. They started in 12 BC, and pretty much most summers they would go over the Rhine with enormous armies of tens of thousands of men and bash the locals about to bring them under the boot, as it were, the Roman boot. And by AD 9, the area between the Rhine and the Elbe, which is roughly 200 to 300 miles east-west, and more than that north-south to this area here, was largely pacified. It was not a Roman province yet, but it was pacified, and the tribes in the darker colors there were allied to Rome. So not all of the tribes in the area, but lots of them in that area east of the Rhine were giving money to Rome and providing warriors who would fight in the Roman auxiliaries. And what's really exciting is that there were some Roman settlements. There were even a couple of Roman towns. So these places here and here and here, they've found archaeological evidence of Roman buildings. So one of them, or two of them in fact, have sewerage systems in some of the houses, and one of them has a municipal building, or in other words a town hall, that measures 50 meters by 80 meters, roughly the size of this building actually, maybe, or slightly bigger. So this was an enormous civic structure that would have been built in a town, or a nascent town, if you like. The Romans did not do that in areas that were regarded as being dangerous or volatile. They just didn't. They built them in areas that were pacified. So that one of them is about 45 miles east of the Rhine, and it's likely that there are other ones to be discovered. But why was the reason that the Romans suffered this huge defeat then? What was the spark that lit the fire? Funnily enough, it was tax. Or at least this is what the ancient sources tell us. So I always like to say at this point And obviously, all of us pay tax. You know, they say death and taxes, so there are only two certain things in life. Well, imagine you had never paid taxes. Imagine that you're an armed population, like America. Imagine that the tax collectors who come to collect the tax from you the first time you ever have to pay it are not of your nationality. Imagine they're Italian or German or French. And they come and knock on your door, and imagine also, because you're a German farmer and you don't have coinage, they didn't, they might have had some Roman coins, but they would have bartered with cattle, with furs, with crops. Imagine you haven't got any money, and some foreign-speaking soldiers come to take money from you, or some of your cattle or your sheep. What would you do? Well, in AD 9, you'd massacre 3 Roman legions. That's what you'd do. The first time I thought of that, I thought, don't be ridiculous. And then the second time I thought, well, actually, if I'd never paid tax, and then some bloke who lives in Rome, 1,000 miles away that I've never heard of, I've got to pay money to him, and soldiers speaking a different language came to take it, I would not be happy. So let's paint this scene a little more brightly. The first historical character you need to know about from the summer of '89 was a man called Publius Quinctilius Varus. He was the Roman governor of Germania. And history has painted him as a fool who sort of should have seen this ambush coming, as a man that wasn't a good military leader, and it's basically political spin. So you only have to look at any scandal of recent times, from the BP thing where they had the oil leak in the Caribbean, to a company that does something. What do? They sack the CEO. They blame the CEO. If there was a defeat, the British Army suffered a defeat historically, any civilization. If the general in question died, that was very useful. You blame him, you brush it all under the carpet. Well, the Roman historians who recorded this event all said Varus was a fool. What better way to wipe this stain from the Roman military memory than to say he was the fellow who should have seen it coming? Well, modern historians are a lot wiser to things than, say, historians were 100 to 200 years ago, and they've had a good look at Varus and his position in the empire. He was one of the most important governors in the whole empire. So he had 5 legions under his command, 1/6 of the Roman army. And Augustus, who was the first emperor and in power at this time, was a conservative man, and we know this from all the appointments he made in his life, because we know so many of them. He didn't appoint people to positions of power that he didn't trust. He usually used members of his family, or people that, if they weren't his family, they were men that he knew could do the job. So he appointed Varus to this job. He wouldn't have done it if he thought he was a fool. And the second good reason that we know that Varus wasn't the gullible person that the Roman historians tell us he was, is that he'd been governor of Judea from the years 4 to 6 AD. And in that time, because it hadn't been pacified for very long, the local Judeans rose up in rebellion, and he put down the rebellion himself using 4 legions. So he mightn't have been Julius Caesar, but he was a capable military commander. And therefore, what happened to him, particularly from a trusted ally, was something that pretty much I don't think anybody could have foreseen. Just a nice little thing with this coin. This is Varus. We know it is because it says it on the coin. Look at that there, and then I've turned the coin sideways, and you can see a small V, big A, big R. That's counter-stamped. It's not definitely Varus. It may have been someone else, but it's probably Varus. And that would have been done because the emperor was the person that the money came from ultimately when the soldiers were given it, but the governor was also the man who was paying the soldiers. And coinage back then, we don't even think about it like this now. We think, oh, who's the nice image on the note or whatever. Most of you probably don't, you wouldn't even think that Queen Elizabeth is on the coin because she's always been on them. But 2,000 years ago, coinage was propaganda. That's what it was for. You put the emperor's face on one side, so everyone in the empire knows what he looks like, and on the other side, you put a military triumph or something like that says he's conquered wherever. And sometimes the local governor would do this. So when the soldier got his money 3 times a year, he knew that Varus had helped to put it in his hand. So the other image or the person you need to know about from this time is Arminius. Now, typically and frustratingly, this may be Arminius, but it also may not. We don't know for sure, but because it might be, I've got him there, because it's better than having a blank screen. So Arminius was a German, and he was the man who masterminded the ambush. Now, his name wasn't Arminius, because clearly that's a Romanized name, But sadly, because the Germans didn't write anything down at this time, so nothing survives from their side of the equation, we don't know what his real name was. It may have been Armin, it may have been Ermin, but the Romans called him Arminius. And he was sent to Rome as a hostage when he was a boy, possibly at the age of about 10, and this would have been for the good behavior of his tribe. In other words, to make sure that his father's tribe didn't rise up against Rome. That kind of thing went on until fairly recent times. And when he was in Rome, he was educated and Romanized, obviously, from just sheer years being there. He joined the Roman army as a youth or young man, and we know that he served in the Roman army in the cavalry in the years AD 6 to 9 in what would be modern-day Croatia / Serbia / Montenegro, where there was a very big war called the Pannonian War. Now, he distinguished himself in battle and was given military awards, the equivalent of medals, and he was also elevated to the junior level of the Roman aristocracy. So he was made an equestrian. So this also, helps us to set aside the notion that Varus should have seen through Arminius' deceit. He was a trusted ally of Rome who'd been made the equivalent of a knight. And therefore, I think it's unfair to expect that Varus would have known or seen through Arminius' plotting. And a lot of Roman reenactors, particularly if they're from Italy, get very excited about Arminius even today. They call him a traitor. If I'm talking about him on Facebook or something, and it'll be Arminius the traitor. And my answer to that is, why was he a traitor? He was German. He didn't like the Romans coming into his homeland and tramping all over the place and killing people and expecting them to pay tax. Oh, well, because he was an ally of Rome. I don't know, I'm baffled by that opinion. I think it's entirely understandable. He probably hated being sent to Rome at the age of 10. He probably got ridiculed endlessly by Roman aristocratic youths for being a savage, and he just hid it very well. So Roman soldiers at this time, you've all seen this type of armor. This is your stereotypical Roman soldier from Hollywood. Well, Roman soldiers were just starting to wear this type of armor, but most of them were still wearing mail. So there's a mail shirt there on the floor. I invite you at the end to come up and pick it up. It weighs about 1.5 stones or 9 kilos. Some of them are wearing this. In fact, one of the first examples of this type of armor was found at the battlefield, which we'll talk about later. And they had those square-edged shields like that. They had the jangly bits here to protect the crown jewels. They all had daggers as well. They had swords that they may still have been using these. This is the Gladius Hispaniensis, or they may have been using the shorter sword, like the one on the table. The point being that they were very heavily armed, very heavily armored, and they were well able to beat pretty much anybody who came up against them. They used javelins as well, and military historians have run a sort of they've counted through the major battles over a couple of 100 years in the Roman Empire, and they won about 70 to 75% of their battles. That's an amazing statistic. And so when you'll see, I'll show you what the German tribesmen look like, and you'll see how lightly armed they were. The fact that they then wiped out 3 legions of these guys is kind of incredible. So this image, you kind of think, what on earth are there dogs on that for? The reason I show you that is because, first of all, the arms and armor that the Roman soldier wore weighed about 25 kilos, or about 4 stone. They also carried all of their non-military equipment on the march as well, and this attack took place on a marching Roman army, so they were all carrying yokes, forked sticks from which dangled their pots, their pans, their blankets, their oil, their grain, their grinding stones, their pickaxes, their shovels, their personal items, and any other gubbins that they needed to carry. There were no backpacks, just these immensely unwieldy things that weighed 2.5 to 3 stone. You can pick that one up in the German museum that I went to, and you walk along with it, and all it wants to do is fall off your shoulder. They wore their shields on their backs. We won't go into why, but when you see them marching along like this on TV, let me tell you, I've marched 500 miles as a Roman soldier, and you can't carry one of them for 20 miles. You'll cripple yourself. You have to have it slung from some part of your body, and on your back is the easiest way to do it. The total weight of the gear they carried was about 40 to 45 kilos, about 7 stone. And if you don't know what that is, it's the same as a large Rottweiler or a really big Labrador. Find one of those that's friendly enough, pick it up, put it on your shoulders, and march 20 miles in 5 hours. That's what Roman soldiers did every day. They were 5'6", they were whippet lean, They lived on flatbread and sour wine, and they did that day after day after day with the weight of a Rottweiler on their shoulders. They were super tough. But the point about the picture is really to show you that imagine you were carrying that and all the gear and you weren't expecting to be attacked. It would just add to the confusion and the ability to fight. So that's a reconstruction of a Roman wagon. They were very narrow, had a very narrow wheelbase actually. If you ever go to Ostia near Rome, or the old Via Appia just outside Rome, you'll see the wheel tracks in the stones, and they're only about that far apart. But the reason I show you this is that to set the scene. So Varus had spent the summer of AD 9 deep in Germany collecting tax, and that would have been very unpopular obviously, but it was done at the point of a sword. So you know, they collected a lot of it, and they would have probably had a lot of goods in kind. So they would have had grain, they would have had skins, they would have had wheat, they would have had livestock as well. So they had an awful lot of stuff to take back with them to their forts on the Rhine. So when the harvest had been taken in, Varus gathered his army and began marching back towards the Rhine. Now we don't know exactly where they were typically, and sadly, but they were about 100 to 200 miles east of the Rhine. And we know from an historian called Josephus, we know the exact formation of a marching Roman army in the 1st century AD. When a Roman army expected to be attacked, they kept all the non-combatants at the back. So you know that this was a tax collecting affair. They weren't expecting to be attacked. There would have been thousands of non-combatants with this army. The soldiers' common law wives could have been with them, and their children. There would have been merchants. There would have been slave traders. There would have been women of ill repute. There would have been priests and you know, snake oil men selling all kinds of stuff. There would have been tradesmen, and they normally, if the Roman army was expecting to be attacked, would have been at the back. But the ancient historians tell us in AD 9 they were mixed up through the marching column. So there were civilians and potentially family members marching beside the soldiers and among them. So this would also add hugely to the confusion when the Germans attacked. So what did the Germans look like? Many of you have probably never seen German tribesmen of the 1st century AD. So a little bit about their tribes and their way of life. There were 40 to 60 tribes in Germany at this time. They fought wars with each other all the time. They didn't have standing armies at all. They were a pastoral or farming people that lived in settlements, some large settlements, but mostly small or just on their own farms. And the only trained warriors would have been the bodyguards of the individual chieftains, which may have been, you know, a couple of hundred men in a big tribe, but would have been less than that in a small tribe. But they were all armed, because people were back then, because you had to be able to defend your home. The arms that they had, though, in comparison to the Romans, were very slight. So they literally had shields and spears, and most of them wouldn't have even had a sword, because a sword was too expensive. So they would have had no helmets, no armor at all. So you can imagine a battle between loads of them lined up against Roman soldiers would only go one way. Yet this battle went completely the other way. So they were essentially what you'd call skirmishing troops, used to attacking and running away. And sometimes people, again, Roman reenactors, often Italian, like to say that they were cowardly when they attacked the Romans in this ambush. Well, when you're dressed like that and you've got no armor, why would you go and try and stand up and fight against a Roman legionary? If you could stab him in the back or throw a spear at him from behind a tree, that's what you're going to do. That's not cowardly, that's clever. But, you know, it's funny how these emotions still run deep. So, where did the battle take place? Well, we know that the Roman army was marching for 1 to 2 days westward, and the column would have been immensely long. When you add in the non-combatants, there were 3 legions. Now, a legion at this time on paper would have been 5,000 men, but like even today, no military unit is ever at full strength. And a lovely piece of information, document survives from Egypt from the 1st century AD, that documents a cohort of Roman soldiers, and it literally names all the guys that are out sick or off somewhere else doing something. And so each legion would probably have been between 3,000 and 4,000 men strong, rather than 5,000. But there were also some non-Roman troops, auxiliary troops, a few thousand of them. So we're talking about 15 to 16 to 17,000 troops, a lot of Roman soldiers. The column would have been at least 10 miles long, possibly as many as 15 miles long. Very, very unwieldy when you've got no way of communicating between the front and the back, let alone the front and the middle. Now, I found this place through Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a lovely place to go to if you want to find out something, but you can't trust it because anybody can write an article on it, as you know. However, if you're wary of it, and you can sometimes find some real jewels, and this, I'm very proud to say, I don't know any other Roman historian or reenactor or a general enthusiast who knew about this before I found it on Wikipedia. It's 2,000-year-old bogland in northern Germany, really close to where they think this battle took place. It's UNESCO World Heritage listed, and it's 2,000 acres in size, so you can walk around it. It's about 5 miles to walk around, and you can walk through it, and this is in October. So that's what the ground looked like when Varus's army was ambushed, because they left the Roman road. We're told by the ancient sources that Arminius came to Varus on the second day, and he told him that, because he was a cavalry commander, so his men would have been riding out around the countryside, he told Varus, who at this stage was a friend of his, so Arminius must have been a silver-tongued man, that he'd had word of a small tribe that had risen up against Rome, and he suggested that they should go and sort them out. Now, we don't know why he agreed, but if Varus had refused, you know, the whole ambush wouldn't have happened, because Arminius knew that ambushing the Romans in open ground, flat open ground, would only result in a Roman victory. But believe Arminius, he did. And so the fateful decision was made to leave the Roman road and to break out into the countryside. So you've seen the Roman wagons. I've told you about the weight that the Roman soldiers were carrying. This is really boggy ground. Imagine trying to bring wagons through that. There's basically no way. Think of Scotland and moorland. That's what it's like. So, you know, you can, if you're just wearing hiking boots and no heavy gear, you can still go up to your knee in the mud. But if you've got wagons full of grain and coins and other things, military equipment, so immediately the Romans ran into difficulties just actually moving forward. And the Germans held back. They were very smart. They didn't attack the Romans until, we're told, nearly the whole column had come off the road. And then they began to attack in the afternoon of this second day. And they attacked in waves, just running in, throwing their spears, and running away again. And the weather turned really bad as well, so say the ancient sources. And modern historians like to often cast aspersions on things like that, because if you think of a film or a book, if you want to make a scene more doom-laden, what better way to do it than to bring in thunder and lightning? And so the ancient historians may have done this. However, meteorologists have been able to find out, I don't know how, but I saw it on a documentary, so I have no reason to disbelieve it, that northern Germany was prone and still is prone to sudden storms in the autumn. So it may be true. As a novelist, I was not going to look this gift horse in the mouth. A scene with thunder and lightning when there's an ambush is perfect. And so Jupiter would be angry with the Romans. That's what they would have thought if they were being ambushed while, you know, there were literally lightning bolts crashing down around them. And the Germans would have thought that Donar, who was their god of thunder, was happy with them. So it would have encouraged the Germans and disheartened the Romans. So regardless of this sort of terrible weather and horrible enemy attacking them and bad terrain, the Romans were nothing if not stubborn. They were very stubborn and very determined. They had a big army. They wouldn't have worried too much that first day. They would have thought, we'll just press on. We'll keep going, and we'll fight the Germans off. We'll get this tribe sorted out, and we'll go back to the road and back to our camps for the winter. So they camped on that first night, and on the second morning, or the third morning, they must have thought things would get better, but they didn't. The weather kept getting worse, in fact, and the German attacks got heavier and heavier. Now, the photograph, I should turn it around, because we're told the Roman army was trying to march north, and the sources tell us that in many places, in many places there was a bog on the right, and on the left there was a hill. And the Germans had built an earthwork with branches and leaves to hide behind, and they would attack out from behind that. So the Romans couldn't go left, they couldn't go right into the bog. All they could do was go forward because they had a huge long column behind them. The ground wasn't firm enough or open enough for their cavalry to deploy. I told you about the civilians and so on. They couldn't form up in their normal formations to fight the Germans. Their artillery was miles back down the column, so they couldn't use that either. So they just had to sort of make up a way of fighting through. And they did. They kept going. They kept fighting and they kept advancing. But they lost an eagle on that day. So each legion, this is a picture, sorry, I'll just talk about this. This is a picture I had painted to try and convey the terror of the attack on the Romans. So you can see the temporary earthworks here. We're told by the sources there were areas of woods as well, so the Germans could have been coming out of the trees. And you may see lying behind my shield later on, there's a leather cover. Roman soldiers wore leather covers on their shields, and when they were marching, they were to protect them from the rain, but they took them off to fight. So when you see them, and there are instances of Caesar's soldiers having to fight with their shield covers on, it means they were really not prepared for the attack. And there's a mule panicking from the noise, and I'll talk more about that later on. So each legion, as you probably know, had had an eagle, and the eagle gave rise to the British battle standard and the French battle standard. It was the symbol and it embodied the courage and the valor of the legion, and had to be defended at all costs. And to lose it to an enemy was one of the most shameful things that could happen to a Roman soldier. A Roman legionary would die rather than allow that to fall into enemy hands. There's quite a funny anecdote that survives from the 2nd century BC, when a Roman army was fighting poorly against an enemy, and they were going to lose. And the commander got so frustrated, he actually seized the eagle from the standard bearer, the equilifer, and they had a spiked butt so they could be put in the earth to stand upright. And he threw it into the enemy ranks and said, literally the whole legion just charged after it, and they won the battle, because anything was better than letting the enemy take the eagle. So my point is that when an eagle was lost, that the morale of that legion would have just started to leak away really fast. During that day, Varus ordered the baggage train to be abandoned and the artillery to be burned. And when they abandoned their baggage train, they would have abandoned most of their food and also their tents. So when they built their camp to sleep in that night, they had nothing to sleep in, and it was still raining. So you can imagine the morale just literally leaching away hour by hour, losing hundreds of their comrades, losing an eagle standard from one legion, sleeping in the open with no food in the autumn, which would have been cold and as well as very wet. And by the following day, we're told that the tribes that hadn't been part of this alliance, so we only know for sure of 3 tribes who took part in the beginning of the ambush, although it was probably more, because it would have had to have been at least 20 to 25,000 warriors to have taken on this many Romans. But by the 3rd day of the ambush, there were tribes coming from further afield. They'd heard the news that this army was being massacred, and they wanted a piece of the action, because nobody liked the Romans, and nobody wanted to pay tax. And so on that day, the Roman cavalry broke away. We don't know if Varus told his cavalry commander to try and make a run for it, or whether he just panicked. They were cut down and killed to a man. More senior officers were lost. Another eagle was lost. And finally, Varus committed suicide. Now, there's no decent image of that, obviously. This is a modern depiction, and I use it because it's the only one I could find, but I have to take exception with it because, it may be a fine piece of carving, but the man or woman who carved it didn't know that you can't stick a dagger through a bronze breastplate unless you're Superman. And even worse, they didn't know that there's a joint here and here in the breastplate. So if you're going to try and stick it in, you do it here. Or, sorry for the banging. More likely you'd actually take your breastplate off and fall on your sword. But this was an honorable death compared to being killed by the enemy or taken prisoner by the enemy. And obviously when the commander killed himself, all sort of spirit left the Roman legionaries, and they were slaughtered. We don't know how many survived. Some did, but it was almost none. And goodness knows, the same happened to all those non-combatants. They wouldn't have had a nice end either. So this was an extraordinary slaughter that took place over 3 days. And the bloodied and battered survivors eventually made their way back to the Rhine. Because, of course, on the Rhine and in Rome and the whole empire, nobody had a clue this had happened because there was no way of communication other than by, someone bringing the news themselves. So when the news reached Rome, reached the Rhine, I should say, it had to be sent to Rome to tell the emperor, who was the commander of the army. And it's about almost 900 miles from northern Germany to Rome. And you will have heard probably of Roman imperial messengers who carried the news everywhere across the empire on the Roman roads. There were way stations every 15 to 20 miles where they could change their horses. It's still a considerable distance. And we're told by the sources that it took only 2 days for the news to get from Germany to Rome. And it affected the aged Emperor Augustus in a big way. So completely out of the blue, 10% of his army wiped out. This is a picture of him in his youth, and just a reason I have the image on the right is just you probably know this, that the Romans painted their statues and their temples and their houses. They didn't look like this. Roman statues looked like this. Again, they were instruments of propaganda, so they had to be imposing. But we're told by the sources that he was so shaken up by this massive defeat that he didn't shave or cut his hair for a number of months, and that he used to wander his palace at night, banging his head on the doors and saying, "Quintilivare legiones rede," which translated means, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." Now, obviously, that wasn't going to happen. I'm just looking at the time. Right, because there's so much ground to cover. This was a body blow to the empire, but it wasn't going to make the Roman Empire fall. So for 5 years, Rome licked its wounds, replaced its slain legionaries, and prepared its revenge. The Romans were a people, especially at this time, who didn't take defeat lying down. There was no way they were going to let this go unanswered. They didn't react immediately because they liked to be methodical. But they certainly believed in revenge being a dish best eaten cold. So by the summer of AD 14, the events in Hunting the Eagles, there was a new governor in Germany, and he was a member of the royal family, the imperial family. His name was Germanicus, and he was a step-grandson of Augustus the Emperor. And he was a young man, only in his 20s, but he was smart, and he was a very good general. And he was planning to invade Germany again in AD 15. But before he could, the emperor died very suddenly in the autumn of AD 14. He was a man in his 70s, which was quite old for Roman times, but what was unexpected was how quickly he died, and this sent, again, panic and shock through the empire. And the legions on the Rhine were quite unhappy already, because many of them had been conscripted into the army in one of the only forcible drafts that ever took place in Roman times, and that was in AD 9 after this defeat. They were also unhappy because they hadn't been paid, and no one is happy when they're not paid, but soldiers that haven't been paid get particularly unhappy because they're expected to risk their lives for nothing. And there were also soldiers, we're told, who should have been discharged from the legions. They were old enough to have been discharged, but their officers weren't letting them. And, obviously everything's computerized now, but back 2,000 years ago, when you joined up, your name would have been recorded on a piece of papyrus or on a wax tablet, and if the centurion happened to lose it, then you had no way of proving that you actually were supposed to leave the legion this year. He'd just say, "I'm sorry, son, I can't find your paperwork." And so a massive mutiny took place directly after the death of the emperor. And the reason I have that cartoon on the right is that we know this is one of these lovely little snapshots we get of Roman history, because basically we know there's more we don't know about Rome than we do. So when you get a nice little image of a person other than an emperor, it's really to be valued. And we know that in Germany at this time there was a Roman centurion on the Rhine whose nickname was Cedo Alteram, and that means "bring me another." Now, Roman centurions, one of the symbols of their office was a vine stick, part of the trunk of a vine. So vine plants can grow, this thick, and they used to carve them into sticks. They're about this big, long I should say, and that thick. And they weren't polished and kept on their mantelpieces. They were used to beat the living daylights out of their soldiers with. And Cedo Alteram had his nickname because he used to break sticks so often on his men's backs. And he'd say, "Cedo Alteram, I'm not finished with this guy. So we're told that when this mutiny took place, that the legionaries seized some of their centurions and they threw them in the Rhine. Well, pick up the mail shirt at the end, and imagine if you were wearing 9 kilos of mail and someone threw you in the river, you would just go glug, 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 glug. They killed other senior officers in front of the legion's commanders, and they basically set up a camp that they controlled. And Germanicus, when he heard the news, he was in Belgium collecting tax. He came hurrying back to sort it out, and rather rashly and naively, he rode straight into the mutineers' camp to sort this out. And again, we have some snapshots that have survived from the ancient texts that were just so golden, I had to put them in the book. One of them was that he jumped, he arrived in the midst of these legionaries and was saying that they had to be loyal to their legions and loyal to Rome and go back to their camps. And they started pulling up their tunics and showing him the wheals and scars from where their officers had beaten them. And one man grabbed Germanicus's hand. It'd be like grabbing Prince Charles's hand. And he stuck his finger in his mouth to show him he had no teeth left. So he was so old, he had no teeth left, and he should have been discharged from the army. And when Germanicus grew enraged and he theatrically half drew his sword and said, "If you don't go back to your camps and do what I tell you, I will kill myself," a soldier called Calusidius, who presumably had a battle-used razor-sharp gladius compared to Germanicus's highly polished piece of weaponry that had certainly never been used in battle, drew his own sword and offered it to Germanicus and said, "Yours doesn't look very sharp, sir. Why don't you use mine?" So Germanicus's bluff was called, and he had to be extricated by his officers safely, which luckily he was. And he was then sort of besieged in the headquarters of the camp. He then tried a ruse about 24 hours later by telling them he had a letter from the emperor telling them their demands would be met. And the legionaries said, "How could you have a letter from the emperor? You only came back yesterday." And Rome was hundreds of miles away. He then the only way he could get out of this situation was to pay them some of the money they were due, and he didn't have enough. So he had to borrow the money from his own senior officers. So it would be like Prince Charles again saying to the Duke of Westminster, "Can you lend me 10 million quid until next week?" This would have been hugely humiliating to Germanicus. And what happened then was the soldiers agreed to go back to their camps, 2 legions to one, 2 legions to another. And I always say at this point in the talk to people, never trust those in authority. To the junior doctors who are striking, do not trust the government when they tell you they'll give you what you want, because they won't. They'll lie and say they will, and then you'll go back to work and they won't. And what happens to soldiers who mutiny, as in this case, is you go back to your camps, and the minute you're in your camp, the Germanicus gets together some loyal soldiers and they drag the mutineers out one by one from their barracks and kill them. And they didn't pay the soldiers the money they were owed, and they didn't discharge, they discharged some of the soldiers. And then he sent word to the other camp where the 3rd and 4th legions were, and he said to the commander there, sort it out before I get to you. So he got a load of loyal men together, but lips flap, and some of the mutineers heard they were going to be killed. So being soldiers and being armed, there was a full-on battle in the camp, and hundreds of soldiers on both sides were killed. Peace was restored, but you can imagine the unhappy air that hung over the fortresses on the Rhine that autumn, still autumn of AD 14. 4 legions of men who'd been turned on it. They'd turned on their leaders, then they'd been slaughtered. The men who'd mutinied, the ringleaders anyway. So Germanicus was very smart. He knew that 5 months of being in barracks would lead to more mutiny if he didn't do something. And he took a chance that the weather would continue to be mild as it is now, and he led an army over the Rhine. So this was outside campaigning season, but they went over the Rhine, about 20,000 of them, and they found the nearest German tribe, who were called the Marsai, and they killed all of them that they could find. And normally when an army went into an area, even up to recent days, is you kill the men, but you leave the women and children, and you take the livestock and the money and whatever you can find. When you want to deliver a really emphatic message that you don't mess with us, i.e. Rome, you do what Germanicus did in October AD 14, and you kill the men, the women, the children, the horses, the cattle, the sheep, the dogs, and the hens, and you just leave them there. And what that does is it delivers the most brutal message that if you mess with Rome, this is what happens to you. And obviously it restored everyone's good, happy spirits because they'd beaten the enemy, and they all went back to camp and waited for spring. And in AD 15, they crossed the Rhine again, this time with 100,000 soldiers. So we're talking genocide. This is what the Romans were going to go and do. And a couple of there weren't any big set-piece battles in the summer of AD 15 because Arminius, who was still leading an alliance of tribes, was way too smart to fight the Romans in open battle. But unluckily for him, and this comes about because he didn't get on with his father-in-law. People always laugh, you don't always get on with your mother-in-law and father-in-law. Well, Arminius didn't get on with his father-in-law because he was allied to the Romans, and he was constantly trying to foment warriors to leave Arminius' alliance and fight with Rome. So Arminius got sick of it, and in AD 14 he took his own father-in-law hostage to stop him talking to people, basically. And that was fine, except Segestes managed to get word to the Romans that he was being held captive, and Germanicus very smartly sent a mobile force, probably cavalry because they can move fast, to snatch and grab Segestes. And when they got into this settlement where Arminius wasn't, who did they find but poor old Arminius' pregnant wife, Thusnelda, and they thought, oh, we'll take you too. And so they seized her and took her back over the Rhine. And you can imagine if your dearest beloved wife, who's heavily pregnant with your first child, is taken, abducted, and you never see her again, because he didn't. She went to Italy where she had a son, and he never saw her again. You can imagine how sort of grief-stricken Arminius must have been. This is again a terrible image because it's a theatrical image from the 1700s. They look more like Vikings than Germans of the 1st century AD. So you can even see he's got wings on his helmet, but it's the only image I could find. And the quoted words that are on that screen there, that's what we're told that Arminius actually said to his fellow Germans. He must have been like a man possessed for what he wanted to do to the Romans now. But he didn't get his wish. The Romans managed to seize back one of the eagles they'd lost. They hit one of the tribes that had been hostile in AD 9, and they found the eagle, and they didn't bring him to bay. And by the autumn, they were marching back to the Rhine again, and Arminius struck again in a boggy area, a bit like the first ambush. And it was sort of the balance of what would happen hung in the balance for about a day and a half. One of the legions panicked and broke away from the army column, but then they saw sense and came back. And Arminius lost a lot of men, and the Romans got safely back to the Rhine. And then in AD 16, I can't tell you what happened there because the book isn't out yet, but they crossed the Rhine again with about 100,000 men in 3 different army groups, and they took the fight to the Germans again. But I want to just talk quickly, just checking the time, I know we're running short, about the Calcresa battlefield, because this is just lovely archaeology and history that weaves into the background of this story. So it's really rare to find the exact location of an ancient battlefield. We know Thermopylae, we know Marathon, we know Alesia, where Caesar fought the Gauls, but we know almost no other sites. For example, we don't know where Boudica was defeated by the Romans. We don't know where the Battle of Mons Graupius, which was in Scotland, is, and so on and so on. And the reason is obvious enough. 2,000 years of history, geography changes. The historians who wrote about it had never been there and probably described it inaccurately, and so on. Artifacts decay, bones rot in the ground. So when this battlefield was found and then potentially identified as the Varian battlefield, it's a really exciting thing. And it's even more sort of lovely because of the way it was found. That's Tony Clun, who was a major in the British Army, and he was stationed in Germany in the 1980s. And when he wasn't being a soldier, he liked to use a metal detector. And he didn't just potter about looking nowhere in particular. He did his homework, and he'd found that a local German noble family, and we're talking Nordrhein-Westphalia, so northern Germany on the Dutch border, about 100 miles south of the North Sea. And he found this local German family who had a history of Roman coins being found on their land for about 200 years. So he went to them and said, would you mind? They said, no, off you go. And so he used to potter about. And on a Sunday in October 1987, he found a coin. Sorry, I showed you the other picture too quickly. He found a coin and he thought, oh wow, Roman coin, brilliant. So he kept on using his metal detector and he found another and another and another. And he found 11 in a line. This is very interesting. So he called in the state archaeologists, which was the right thing to do because everything about a find like this depends on context. And so after looking more carefully, they found 168 Roman coins. And the lovely thing about these is, when you're in this museum, you can't see it here because the photo's too far away, but they've been cleaned, obviously, but they're in such good condition, you can actually read the writing on them. They look as new as a coin from 5 or 10 years ago. So you can see the name of the legion, you can see the name of the emperor or the general who's commemorated on them. So brilliant, you've got 168 Roman coins. That would make anybody happy. But it doesn't mean anything other than someone lost 168 Roman coins 2,000 years ago. It doesn't mean it was a Roman. It could have been a German who'd been trading on the other side of the Rhine. He'd sold his cattle and his furs, and this was what he'd made. But then they found these. Now, these are not pieces of dog poo that have gone white in the sun. They are lead slingshot bullets, and they've gone white because of the reaction of the lead with the soil. Now, the only soldiers 2,000 years ago who used lead slingshot bullets were Roman slingers. So when they found this, everybody got very excited. And this is where they found them. This is in the village of Kalkrisa, which is in North Rhine-Westphalia. And although this is the area that they started in October 1987, the Digg has been going on every summer for the last 29 years and now runs along a length of 30 miles, which is quite extraordinary. So this obviously wasn't a town. They found these then after a couple of years. And you don't have to be a scientist to see the skull and the leg bone there. They found bone pits with skeletons in them, about 30 to 40 of them, all men, all male, aged between 20 and 40. All of them died violently. How do we know they died violently, I hear you ask? Well, if I fall off this stage and break my arm, and the hospital nearby plasters my arm, and it all heals, and I die of old age, and in 2,000 years you find my skeleton, there will be a callus or a lump on both of my forearm bones, and you'll say, that man broke his arm as an adult, and then he died of something else when he was older. If I go out the door tonight and the axe-wielding maniac of Lytham St. Anne's chops me limb from limb, I will have hack wounds all over my bones, like that. Look at that there. That's a hack wound from a sword. So all these bones have hack wounds on them. So they died in battle. And they weren't German skeletons, and they didn't need to do DNA or anything on them to know that, because the Germans would have taken their dead away and buried them with honor. These were Roman soldiers, and they knew they were Roman soldiers because they started finding thousands of pieces of militaria. That's a piece of armor, that's a spearhead, that's a helmet, that's a sandal there with the hobnails, that's a pickaxe, the head of a pickaxe, and scabbard fittings, horse fittings, more spearheads, literally thousands and thousands of pieces of Roman military equipment. Civilian bits and bobs as well. I use this one. That's a wine sieve, because I'd never seen a Roman wine sieve. They didn't filter the wine 2,000 years ago, so your wine, cheap wine anyway, would have been full of grape skins and seeds. So if you didn't want to be spitting them out while you were drinking, you filtered your wine first. And this brings us back to the mule in the picture. They found lots of mule bells. So the Roman army used mules to carry their equipment and possibly to pull wagons as well. And they used to put bells around their necks so that when they were grazing at the end of the day or when they weren't marching, they could find them, a bit like people do in Africa, and if you've ever been to Switzerland, they do as well. They have bells on the cows. And the amazing thing about these bells is that the ancient sources tell us that at one stage during the ambush in AD 9, the Roman mule handlers picked up grass, they ripped grass from the ground, and they stuffed it into the bells to stop the clapper from hitting the side and alerting the Germans to their position. Well, what do you think they found in those bells? Grass. And you can date grass to the month it was picked, and it was picked in September. So I get goosebumps every single time I say that. To find something in the ground that directly links to an historical reference from 2,000 years ago is really unique. This is probably something you recognize. It's one of the most iconic Roman archaeological finds ever. It's the face piece of a Roman cavalry helmet. So on parade and quite possibly in battle, Roman cavalrymen wore a very ornate helmet that had braided horsehair like this, so it looked like human hair, and it had a hinged facepiece that did that, and the front was covered in a layer of silver foil, real silver. There is real silver pieces that were found on the battlefield, probably from scabbards, but you can see how this helmet has had a knife put in there, and there, and there, because the man who killed the Roman wearing that used his knife to take the foil off because it was valuable, and then he may have dropped it because there's the proof there. But what's amazing about this helmet is not just the way it looks and the fact that we can see that the silver's been taken off it. The molding of the face underneath is so accurate. It was made for someone. They've been able to reconstruct the face of the man that wore it. So he had wide cheekbones and a scar on his chin and a scar on his forehead, and was possibly North African. But also where it was found. So I described earlier the earthwork that the Germans had built. Some of that has been found as well, about 400 meters of it. So this is again lending weight to the idea that this is the battlefield. But this facepiece was found if that part of my hand is the vertical part of the earthwork and this is the ground, the facepiece was found propped up against it. So this is where context is just absolutely lovely. Because if you just found it face down in the muck, you would have thought this was amazing. But it was found as it had been left by a German warrior. So to kill a cavalryman was a very prestigious thing, because even today, I know British cavalry regiments, they're in tanks, but there's a thing about them being better than infantry. So to kill a cavalryman of the enemy was a prestigious thing. You make yourself wealthy by taking the silver, but then to leave the front of his helmet there like that, it's a memento mori that says very loudly and clearly to any Roman who ever came back there, if you come around here, this is what we do to you. And so it's just amazing. And that's about it. There's one tombstone that survives of a soldier who was killed. I show the picture because it's quite poignant when you translate the writing. He was the most senior centurion of the 18th Legion. And what it says is that he was killed in the Varian War, and his bones do not lie here. And this was erected by his brother. So, if we lose someone at sea or in an air crash today, people still hold a funeral because they want to be able to grieve for their loved one. Well, 2,000 years ago, people were the same. And then three other things. This is my favorite archaeological find that I've ever seen. It's just some bits of wood. And when I do talks in schools, I think of myself as a 12 to 15-year-old rolling my eyes and saying, so what? It's a piece of wood from 2,000 years ago. What's really lovely is what's written on those pieces of wood. So on the right, you can see those are modern reconstructions of these palisade stakes. When they were marching, Roman soldiers had to carry one or two of them each. And when they built their temporary camp at the end of a day's march, they used to stick them in the outside of the earthen rampart to stop the enemy climbing up at night. And I always love it when there's a division down the room. I'll divide you into 2 centuries of soldiers. If you were marching, you're 20 miles, and you got attacked by the enemy, or you had to go through a big river or something, this century, you might have lost a load of your palisade stakes, and you lot didn't. And when you were digging out the camp at the end of the day's march, your centurion, you'd get to the certain stage when the rampart was this high, and the centurion would say, right, boys, palisade stakes. And if you didn't have your palisade stake, you would be badly punished by the centurion and then sent over to the nearest woods to chop down some trees. Or you could look over to this lot who were doing something else over there, like hauling water from the river, and you could nick all their palisade stakes, and then the centurion wouldn't punish you. Well, Centurion Fabius of the 2nd century of we don't know what legion got his men to scratch his name on every single one of those bits of wood. You can still read it on all of them because he didn't want his men losing their palisade stakes to this lot because it had clearly happened to him. So it's really that things like that are so rare, but they really open up the door to the past to show us that in many ways the Romans were like us. And here's another one that I love. These are all from German museums close to this battlefield. That is the cross-section of a branch of a tree, and there's writing on it you can see there. And what it was a piece of equipment, a little small platter used by a Roman army surgeon to mix his medicines on. So he might have had clay plates, but this guy obviously used little wooden ones as well. And what's written on it is Ex Radici Britannici, and translated, that means from the British root, which was probably dock. So it's unique. There's nothing else like this has been found anywhere in the empire, but it's also a very personal piece of equipment. He didn't want to mix dock with his other herbs and medicines because they might not do what they were supposed to do. So he scratched that on it so he'd never make a mistake. Like, you know, you use one chopping board for onions and another one for your bread, so your bread doesn't smell of onions. And the last one is this, which is, you may have heard 2 years ago, Fenwick, the smart department store in Colchester, they were having some renovations done, and if you'll know probably that Boudicca's warriors burnt Colchester to the ground in AD 61 and slaughtered all the inhabitants. If you dig 6 to 10 feet down into the centre of Colchester today, you find a layer of ash, and that ash dates to 61, when the town was burnt down. And when Fenwick was having some work done in its basement 2 years ago, they came down to the level of ash, and they knew we have to call in the archaeologists, so they did. And they found wooden floorboards, and beneath the wooden floorboards they found a wooden jewellery box, and in that was the jewellery belonging to a Roman woman who would have been in Colchester on the day it was attacked. So she may have escaped, more probably she didn't, and this was her valuables that she'd never got out. Well, after the slaughter in the forest in AD 9, the Germans swept through all the Roman forts east of the Rhine and they burnt them. And so when they excavate in them and they find the layer of ash, they know it dates to AD 9. Underneath the barrack floor of one of these forts, they found this. There's one gold coin there and 160 or 180 silver coins. This was the life savings of a legionary who was probably killed, and even if he wasn't, he left all his money behind. And we know that it dates to exactly that time, which is also quite unusual. You can usually only date something to within a few years of a particular event rather than an exact. So I'll stop there because I know it's gone past 8 o'clock, and hopefully you may have a few questions. And if you haven't, you probably want to go home. But thank you. So any questions? Just raise your hand. And do we have a roving mic? Is that the way you do it? Or not? Yes? Is it? Where would you go in to see all those artifacts? Yeah, so in brief, Roman museums in Germany put British ones to shame, sadly. Considering the impact that Rome had on Britain and the length of time it was here and how little impact they had on Germany, they must have just put a lot more money into it. So they're listed in the back of the current 2 books because lots of people ask me this and they like to go there. And it's a lovely journey because you can fly into a Ryanair airport it's actually in Holland, in a place called Weeze, which is a former RAF base and still has all the hangars. And you're right beside this town that had a double Legion fortress in it. And you can drive down the Rhine over 4 or 5 days and visit all these museums, and then you can fly out of Frankfurt and drop your car off there so you don't have to go back on yourself. It's a lovely, lovely trip. If you haven't got those books and you don't want to buy them, which is fine, email me and I have an email that I'll just send to you, ben@benkane.net, and I'll list them out for you. It's a really nice trip. Yeah, some incredible museums. They have an entire cohort-sized fort near Frankfurt that Kaiser Wilhelm I had built accurately, and you can visit it and just walk around the barracks and everything. It's just extraordinary. Yeah, amazing. Anybody else? Yeah, did you? No? Yes, hi. Did the Roman army have a scouting system, and so why didn't they pick up this huge number of German warriors about to ambush them? Good question. They did. They used to use most commonly their cavalry as scouts, but Arminius was one of the senior cavalry commanders, so they would have been lying about what they saw. And the second reason is that, to go back again to the fact that they thought they were marching through peaceful territory. So if they had thought they were, if they had been in Judea or somewhere, or in Hungary campaigning, there would have been scouts all around, but they didn't expect it, which is why the civilians were all mixed up with the column as well. So they should have, but they just didn't think it would happen. So, anybody else?
Why was there only one gold coin in the silver coins?
Why was there only one gold coin and all those silver coins in that find? A good question. There are a number of reasons. One is that as an ordinary soldier, a Roman legionary wouldn't have had many gold coins, because he was only paid about 9 gold coins in a whole year. And when he was paid, he probably wasn't given them as gold coins, but the equivalent in silver. And the second thing is that at this time, and even for most of Rome's history, gold coins were quite rare anyway. So probably only, have you ever seen a £50 note? We don't see very many of them. There used to be £100 notes a long time ago, and you didn't see them very often either. So this was sort of the equivalent of a £100 or more note, and that's why. The most common coins were silver or bronze. So it was probably something he'd really saved hard to have. Yes, hi. Have I ever fancied going back to being a vet? In a word, no. I thank all my readers in every book for buying my books, because it's thanks to them that I don't have to go back to being a vet. And people say, oh, well, if the books don't work out, you can always go back to being a vet. And the simple answer is I could, but I wouldn't. And the reason is that that massive fear thing I had of jumping from a good, solid job to, when I made the transition to being a full-time author, I still wasn't earning enough to live on. It was a jump of faith. It was so utterly terrifying, and I did it with a 1.5-year-old, married with a 1.5-year-old. I know I could do something else, so I don't know, have a cafe or a B&B or something. I'd have a go at something else. I'd never go back to veterinary. And my friends from vet college, who, 25 years ago, when I meet up with them, and they just look at me and I say, you're not a vet anymore. Now, if I try and say something, if they're talking veterinary stuff. So I don't think I'd be let either. Yes, sir. In this ambush, were the Roman legions outnumbered in this ambush? Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear enough. Yes, they must have been, but probably by not very much. There's so much material to pack into this talk. Normally, what I should have emphasized to show you the magnitude of this defeat, normally if a barbarian people, a non-Roman people, were to defeat a Roman army, they had to outnumber it by 4 to 6 to 1. So if you had 20,000 Roman soldiers, you needed 60, 80, 100,000 men to ensure you could wipe them out, because the Romans were so good, so organized, so disciplined. And yet the population of Germany and the size of the tribes and the fact that we only know 3 were involved mean that Arminius can't have had that many men. He could have only had about 20, 25,000, maybe 30,000, but not those enormous multiplied figures to outnumber the Romans, which sort of means that he did an incredible job. Even though it was an ambush, it was still amazing that they wiped these legions out. So yeah, they were outnumbered, but not that much. I think the terrain and the disorganization and the bad weather and the fact they couldn't use their artillery, and their cavalry would have swept up the Germans, and their artillery could shoot 200 to 300 yards, arrows that long, this thick, stones this big that would splatter 4 people. If you've got to stand facing an army that's doing that to you for 15 minutes, your morale is going to be in bits before they even hit you, so they couldn't do things like that. And the Germans just literally hit them and ran away, and hit them and ran away. Yes, sir.
We'll have to make this the final question.
Oh, okay. Again, another great question. So did the Romans reoccupy those parts of Germany, or did they retreat? I didn't fully go into that, because that's what happens in book 3. And also it's time. They, after practicing this genocide for 3 summers, October 14, summer of 15, summer of 16 AD, they had every intention of crossing the Rhine again in 17 AD and finishing the job, because in AD 16 they really did hammer the Germans and beat Arminius. And Germanicus's intention was to go and finish the job and to continue the colonization as far as the Elbe. But at that stage, Tiberius, who was the new emperor, stepped in, and we have some documentation has survived of the letters between them, and he ordered Germanicus to stop. And Germanicus protested and said, you know, it's there for the taking. And he told him that one of the codicils in Augustus's will had been that the borders of the Roman Empire should be left where they were at his death. So that's why historians wrote that that defeat stopped Rome. But it didn't, because for 3 summers they went over and did the job. It stopped because Tiberius told Germanicus to. And if Germanicus had disobeyed him, that would have been treasonous and he would have been killed. So he did what he was told, and he was posted elsewhere in the empire. And he died only a couple of years later, actually, of illness. But that was when the border then became the Rhine. But, you know, history's always being discovered. So there's a battlefield. The Romans didn't just stay there all the time. So even though we haven't got documentary evidence, they found a battlefield at a place called Hartshorn, which is about 250 miles east of the Rhine. And it's a really big battlefield that's still being excavated, and its location is secret because German archaeologists don't want people looting it. And it dates to the 3rd century AD. So this was a Roman army 250 years later, way further than they should have been, fighting the Germans. So they didn't just stop, but we don't know how, when they went and why and for how long. But they certainly didn't occupy it and make it into a Roman province. And so Germany was never Romanized, and that has had an impact, I think, on the German psyche, whether they know it or not. Because, you know, look at Hitler. You know, it's the only part of Western Europe never Romanized, and I think they've got a very strong sense of self-identity ever since. So I think it'd be better stop now. Yeah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonah, and it is my job this evening to give the vote of thanks to Mr. Ben Kane. I'd like to start by thanking you all for attending and supporting the biggest and best classical association in the whole country. I am sure you will all join me in thanking our special speaker tonight, Mr. Ben Kane.
Thank you.
Mr. Kane, I really enjoyed your speech. I'm not usually into Romans, but you made it sound so interesting. I was really interested in learning about how far a soldier walks, carrying 45 kilograms. I bet my dad couldn't do that. I was delighted in hearing your experience in cycling Hannibal's route. Did that go well?
It did. It was very tough, but yeah, it did. Thank you. Yeah.
Tougher than being a Roman soldier?
No. Definitely not.
I think I'm probably going to read your books now after your lecture.
I think you might be a bit young still.
Next year?
I don't know, what age are you?
9.
No, maybe a few years, I'm afraid. My boy's 10 and he's asking me and I'm saying no.